The crystal glass in Julian Vance's hand felt unnaturally heavy as he swirled the deep red Cabernet. The clinking of silverware and muted conversations of the city's elite fading into a meaningless hum. Across the starched white linen of the table at Etoile, Victoria was recounting a story about a rival socialite's fashion faux pas, her voice a polished, musical instrument that demanded attention. She was beautiful, impeccably dressed in a sapphire dress that matched the enormous gem on her finger. A gift from him, a placeholder in a relationship built on convenience and shared social standing. Julian nodded at the appropriate moments, his lips forming a practiced smile, but his mind was miles away, lost in the hollow echo that had become his life. He was the CEO of Vance Holdings, a titan of finance whose name was a synonym for ruthless success. Yet he felt like a ghost haunting his own existence. Victoria paused, her perfectly sculpted eyebrow raising a fraction. "Julian, are you even listening to me?" Before he could formulate a response, a shadow fell over their table. "Good evening," a soft, hesitant voice said. "My name is Amelia, and I'll be your server tonight." Julian's world stopped. He looked up, and the air left his lungs in a silent rush. It was her, Amelia, his Amelia. But it wasn't the same woman he had last seen a year ago, her eyes filled with a grief that mirrored his own. This Amelia was thinner, her face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. Her simple black server's uniform was a stark contrast to the designer gown she had worn the last time they were in a restaurant like this. But it wasn't her tired eyes or the server's uniform that made his heart seize in his chest. It was the gentle, unmistakable swell of her stomach beneath the fabric. Amelia was pregnant. Victoria's sharp gasp broke the spell. "Well, what a surprise," she said, her voice dripping with condescension as she looked Amelia up and down. "I didn't realize this place hired such inexperienced staff." Amelia's gaze flickered from Victoria's cruel smile to Julian's frozen, shocked face. Her own expression was a maelstrom of panic and pain. This was not a coincidence. This was a cosmic cruelty, a twist of fate so sharp it felt like a physical blow. She had taken this demeaning, exhausting job, working on her feet for 10 hours a day, because she was desperate, because the medical bills were piling up, because she needed to provide for the tiny life growing inside her. She had never imagined that the first table she would be assigned on her first night would be his. "I can get another server if you prefer," Amelia said, her voice trembling slightly, but her chin held high, with a pride Julian remembered so well, a pride that had both captivated and infuriated him. "No, that won't be necessary," Julian heard himself say, his voice sounding distant and strange to his own ears. His mind was a chaotic storm. Pregnant? How? When? He did a rapid, brutal calculation. It had been nearly a year since their marriage had shattered, since he had pushed her away in a haze of unimaginable grief. The timing, it was impossible. It couldn't be. And yet, as he looked at her, at the familiar curve of her jaw and the stubborn light in her hazel eyes, a devastating certainty began to dawn. Victoria, oblivious to the silent cataclysm unfolding before her, waved a dismissive hand. "We'll start with the champagne. The vintage label, of course." She didn't look at Amelia as she spoke, as if she were a piece of furniture. Amelia's hand instinctively went to her stomach in a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by Julian. "Of course," she said, her professionalism a thin, fragile shield. As she turned to walk away, her body swaying with a fatigue that was more than just physical, Julian felt an unfamiliar emotion rise within him, overriding the shock, overriding the confusion. It was a white-hot, protective rage. He watched her retreat, his dinner, his date, his entire carefully constructed life forgotten. The ghost at the table was no longer him. It was the vibrant, loving woman he had systematically destroyed, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he could not let her walk away again. Julian couldn't tear his eyes away from Amelia as she moved through the restaurant. He watched her every step, every forced smile she gave to a patron, every time her hand drifted to her back to ease an ache he could only imagine. The world had narrowed to this single, unbelievable reality. Victoria's voice became a sharp, irritating buzz in his ear. "Julian, for heaven's sake, what is wrong with you? You're staring at the waitress as if you've seen a ghost." "I need some air," he said abruptly, pushing his chair back. The excuse was flimsy, but he didn't care. He tossed his black credit card onto the table. "Pay the bill. I'll have my driver take you home." Victoria's perfectly painted mouth fell open in outrage. "You're leaving me, in the middle of dinner, for a pregnant waitress." "This dinner is over," Julian said, his voice a low command that brooked no argument. He turned and walked away without a backward glance, leaving his girlfriend sputtering in a wake of shock and fury. He found Amelia in a small alcove near the kitchen, her back to him, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion as she leaned against the wall. He could see her struggling to catch her breath. "Amelia," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She spun around, startled, her hand flying to her chest. "Julian, you can't be back here. This is for staff only." "I don't care," he said, stepping closer. The scent of lemons and something uniquely her, a scent he thought he had forgotten, filled his senses. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," she said, trying to push past him. "I have to work." He blocked her path, his presence filling the small space. "Don't lie to me. Not about this." His gaze dropped to her swollen belly. "Is it mine?" The question hung between them, raw and heavy. She looked away, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It doesn't matter who the father is," she whispered. "I'm handling it on my own." "Like hell you are," he said, his voice a low growl. "Look at me, Amelia." Reluctantly, she met his gaze. He saw the pride, the fear, and the deep, abiding hurt that he had put there. "I know I lost the right to ask you for anything a long time ago," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "But I'm asking you now. I'm begging you. Tell me the truth." The truth was a complicated, painful thing. It was tangled in the wreckage of their love story, a story that had begun with so much hope and ended in a silence so profound it had shattered them both. They had been happy, deliriously so. They had been that couple, the one that friends envied, the one that seemed to have it all. Then had come the dream of a family, a dream that had turned into a nightmare. Their first child, a son they had named Leo, had been stillborn. The grief that followed was a tidal wave, and it had drowned them. Julian, who had built his life on control and logic, couldn't control this. He couldn't fix it. The pain was a physical entity, a monster in their home, and he had run from it. He had buried himself in work, in 18-hour days and transatlantic flights, leaving Amelia to navigate the vast, empty ocean of her sorrow alone. He had told himself he was giving her space, but he knew, in the darkest corners of his soul, that he was a coward. He had been terrified that her grief, a mirror of his own, would pull him under for good. "I can't lose you too," he had told her in their final, devastating argument. "I need to breathe." What she had heard was, "You are suffocating me." And so she had left, quietly and without a fight, taking her broken heart with her. She had wanted to disappear, to heal somewhere he couldn't see her pain. A month later, she had discovered the impossible. A tiny, miraculous life had taken root in the midst of their tragedy. A second chance. But how could she tell him? How could she bring the news of a new baby to a man who couldn't even bear to look at the empty nursery in their home? She had been trying to protect him, to shield him from a hope that might lead to more devastation if something went wrong. She had decided to carry this fragile, new hope alone. "Yes," she finally whispered in the quiet alcove, the single word of confession and an accusation. "He's yours, Julian." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He staggered back a step, leaning against the wall for support. A son, another son. A wave of emotions so powerful it threatened to bring him to his knees crashed over him. Joy, terror, regret, and a love so fierce it was a physical pain. "Why?" he choked out. "Amelia, why didn't you tell me?" "Because you ran," she said, the tears finally falling, silent streams tracking through the weariness on her face. "You ran from me. You ran from Leo. How could I ask you to run toward this?" He had no answer. She was right. He had been a coward, and his cowardice had cost him nearly a year of his child's life. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just the mother of his unborn son, but the woman he had never stopped loving, the woman he had abandoned in her darkest hour. "You're done," he said, his voice regaining its familiar tone of command, but this time it was laced with a desperate tenderness. "You're not working another minute in this place." "I have to," she protested weakly. "I need the money." "You will never need to worry about money again," he said, pulling out his phone. He made a quick, decisive call to his head of security. "I need you to come to Itoil now and bring the car." He ended the call and turned back to her, his expression resolute. "You're coming home with me." "I don't have a home with you anymore, Julian," she said softly. "Then we'll make a new one," he replied, his voice thick with a promise he intended to keep, no matter what it took. For him, and for us. The drive to Julian's penthouse was a blur of tense silence. Amelia sat stiffly on the opposite side of the plush leather seat, her arms wrapped protectively around her stomach as if she could shield her unborn child from the tumultuous emotions that filled the car. Julian kept glancing at her, his mind racing. He had acted on pure, gut-wrenching instinct, but now, the logistical and emotional complexities of the situation began to crash down on him. He had just publicly humiliated his girlfriend, effectively ending that sterile relationship in the most dramatic way possible. He had essentially kidnapped his pregnant ex-wife from her job, and he had no idea what to do next. The penthouse, once his sanctuary of minimalist, lonely perfection, now felt cold and unwelcoming. It was a monument to a life that was no longer his. He saw it now through her eyes, the stark white walls, the modern art that was more of an investment than an expression of joy, the sprawling, empty spaces. It was the home of a man who had forgotten how to live. "You can have the guest wing," he said as they stepped out of the private elevator. "It has its own kitchen, a sitting room. You'll have privacy." Amelia looked around the vast, silent living room, her expression unreadable. "This isn't a long-term solution, Julian." "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of uncertainty. "This is just for tonight. For now, until we can figure things out." He watched as she walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, her silhouette framed against the glittering backdrop of the city. She looked so fragile, so out of place in his sterile world. "I need to understand what you want," she said, her back still to him. "Do you want to be a father to this child, or do you just want to assuage your guilt by throwing money at the problem?" The question was a scalpel, cutting straight to the heart of his own internal conflict. For years, money had been his answer to everything. A problem at work, acquire the competition, a political issue, a well-placed donation, his own crushing grief, build a bigger, emptier empire. "I want to be his father," he said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I don't know how. I failed at it once. But I want to try. And I want to be there for you, Amelia. Not as a bank account, but as a partner, if you'll let me." She turned to face him, her eyes searching his for the truth. "The last time we were partners, Julian, you disappeared when I needed you most. How do I know you won't do it again when things get hard?" He had no easy answer, no contract he could sign, no guarantee he could offer. He could only offer the broken, humbled truth. "Because I have spent every day of the last year living in a hell of my own making," he said, his voice raw. "The only thing worse than the pain of losing Leo was the pain of losing you. I will not make that mistake again. I cannot survive it again." He took a hesitant step toward her. "I know I don't deserve a second chance, but our son does. He deserves to have a father who is present, who is fighting for him. And I will fight, Amelia. I will fight for him, and I will fight for you." The vulnerability in his confession chipped away at the wall she had built around her heart. She saw the man she had fallen in love with, the man who existed beneath the layers of power and pain. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord. "Asterisk rent is 3 days late. I need the money by tomorrow or you're out." Asterisk, the harsh reality of her situation crashed back in. She was exhausted, pregnant, and on the verge of homelessness. Her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She looked at Julian, at the desperate hope in his eyes, and made a decision. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. Okay, Julian, she said, her voice barely a whisper. We'll try. For the baby. Relief washed over his features, so profound it was almost painful to watch. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. I've already made an appointment with Dr. Evans for tomorrow morning, he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its usual efficiency. She's the best obstetrician in the country. I want to make sure you and the baby are getting the best possible care. And just like that, the full force of Julian Vance's resources was mobilized. Within hours, her life began to transform. A personal assistant was tasked with retrieving her belongings from her cramped, run-down apartment. A nutritionist was consulted to create a prenatal meal plan. Her schedule, once a chaotic mess of work shifts and bus timetables, was now being managed with corporate precision. Amelia felt like she was being swept away by a tidal wave, and she wasn't sure if she was drowning or being rescued. The next morning, as they sat in the plush waiting room of the city's most exclusive medical clinic, the chasm between their worlds felt wider than ever. This was a world of privilege and access she had never known. Julian sat beside her, reviewing documents on his tablet, a silent, powerful presence. He had already had a long and heated phone call that morning, and she had overheard a name, Victoria. It was clear that the fallout from the previous night was just beginning. Just as Dr. Evans called him back, Julian's phone rang again. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening. I have to take this, he said to her. It's my mother. He walked a few paces away, his voice a low, controlled murmur. Amelia watched him, a sense of unease settling over her. She knew his mother, a formidable matriarch who valued social standing above all else. Genevieve Vance had never fully approved of Amelia, considering her too soft, too emotional for her brilliant, ambitious son. She could only imagine what Julian was telling her now, and what her reaction would be. The doctor's appointment was a blur of tests and scans. But then came the moment that changed everything again. Dr. Evans moved the ultrasound wand across Amelia's belly, and a strong, steady, rhythmic sound filled the room. The heartbeat, their son's heartbeat. Amelia's breath caught, tears springing to her eyes. She looked over at Julian, who had ended his call and was now standing beside the examination table. He was staring at the monitor, at the tiny, flickering image of their child, and his carefully constructed mask of control had completely shattered. His face was a portrait of pure, unguarded wonder. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers gripping hers tightly. In that moment, they weren't a billionaire and his broken ex-wife. They were just a man and a woman, bound together by the miraculous, terrifying, and overwhelming reality of the new life they had created. The world outside, with its angry girlfriends and disapproving mothers, faded away. All that mattered was the steady, hopeful rhythm of their son's heart. The weeks that followed were a fragile truce with reality. Julian and Amelia existed in a bubble, their world revolving around the pregnancy. He insisted she move into the penthouse permanently, transforming the entire guest wing into a serene sanctuary for her. He hired a private chef to prepare her nutritionally balanced meals and a prenatal yoga instructor to help with the aches and pains of her third trimester. On the surface, it was a perfect arrangement, but underneath, the fault lines of their past remained. Julian's mother, Genevieve, became a frequent, unwelcome visitor. She would sweep into the penthouse, her Chanel suit a suit of armor, her critical gaze missing nothing. She treated Amelia with a cool, polite disdain, making it clear she viewed her as an unfortunate complication. I spoke with Victoria, Genevieve said one afternoon, sipping tea in the vast living room while Amelia tried to read. The poor girl is devastated. Julian, you've created a terrible scandal. I've created a family, mother, Julian countered, his tone icy. He had become fiercely protective of Amelia, shielding her from the worst of his mother's barbs. You've created a mess, Genevieve sniffed. And what happens after this baby is born? You can't possibly think of remarrying her. It would be a disaster for the company's image. The words, though not directed at her, struck Amelia with the force of a slap. She had been so focused on the baby, on her fragile reconnection with Julian, that she hadn't allowed herself to think about the future, about what their relationship truly was. Were they just co-parents? Was he just fulfilling an obligation? That night, she confronted him. "Your mother is right about one thing," she said, her voice quiet. "We haven't talked about what this is. Are you with me, Julian? Or are you just taking care of me?" Julian put down the book he was reading and gave her his full attention. He had been learning to do that, to be present in a way he never had before. "I'm with you," he said, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "Victoria, the scandal, my mother's opinions, none of it matters to me. All that matters is you and this baby." He stood and came to sit beside her on the sofa, taking her hands in his. "I know this is backward. I know I should have done this a year ago. I should have fought for you, not run from you." He pulled a small, velvet box from his pocket. Amelia's breath caught. "I'm not asking you to forgive me overnight. I'm not asking you to forget the pain I caused. I'm asking you to let me spend the rest of my life making it up to you. To let me be the husband I should have been and the father our son deserves." He opened the box. Inside was not a new, ostentatious diamond, but her original engagement ring, the simple, elegant one he had given her when their future seemed so bright. He had kept it. All this time, he had kept it. "Amelia," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "will you marry me?" Again, tears streamed down her face as she looked from the ring to the earnest, hopeful face of the man she had never truly stopped loving. Their journey back to each other had been born from the deepest sorrow, but it had led them to this moment of profound, unexpected joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Julian, I will." The tension in the penthouse eased after that, replaced by a quiet, joyful anticipation. Julian's mother, upon learning of their re-engagement, retreated into a frosty silence, but her disapproval no longer had the power to hurt them. They were a united front, a team. They spent their evenings in the nursery, which they had designed together, a room of soft blues and grays, filled with a sense of peace and hope. Julian would read to her belly, his deep voice a soothing rumble, and Amelia would watch him, her heart full. It was during one of these quiet nights that the first real pain hit, sharp and sudden, weeks before her due date. Panic, a cold ghost from the past, flickered in Julian's eyes. But this time, he didn't run. He took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "I'm here," he said, his voice a calm anchor in her rising fear. "I'm not going anywhere. We're going to do this together." At the hospital, the same one where their first son had been lost, Julian never left her side. He held her hand through every contraction, his strength her own. He breathed with her. He encouraged her. He was the partner he had been too broken to be the first time around. And when their son was finally born, a healthy, crying miracle, the doctor placed him not on Amelia's chest, but in Julian's arms. Julian looked down at the tiny, perfect face of his son, and the last of his grief, the last of his fear, washed away, replaced by a love so overwhelming it was a rebirth. He brought the baby to Amelia, his own face wet with tears. "He looks just like you," she whispered, touching the baby's soft cheek. "He has your eyes," Julian said, his voice choked with emotion. They named him Samuel, meaning God has heard, because in the midst of their darkest silence, their prayers for a second chance had been answered. A month later, Amelia stood at the window of the nursery in their new home. They had sold the cold penthouse and bought a sprawling house in the country, a place with a garden and giant oak trees, a place for a family to grow. She watched Julian in the yard, rocking Samuel in his arms, his face alight with a serene joy she had never seen before. He looked up and saw her watching, and his smile widened. He had become the man she had always known he could be. Their journey had not been a fairy tale. It had been a painful, messy, and complicated path back from the brink. But as she looked at her husband and her son, bathed in the warm light of the afternoon sun, she knew they had found something even better than a fairy tale ending. They had found a real beginning.